Hi, everyone. We still have some people logging in, but I'm going to go ahead and start where we're going to launch into this webinar series. Those of you that have been joining us on this journey over the past, I guess, few months now, we've been doing something different with the webinar where we have been doing panel discussions, and we found it to be a great learning for us and really interactive for participants as well. We all understand the death by PowerPoint situation we've all been in the past year and a half, but also we like to reach out to those that are smarter than us. And it turns out we all have friends that are experts in different fields, and it's really great to get those people together and discuss different topics. Today, for the webinar series, we're going to be doing Innovation Lab, a frank discussion about innovation essentials. So without further ado, I'm going to launch right into a brief introduction before we go ahead and bring on the panelists. So for today's webinar, again, Innovation Lab, a frank discussion on innovation essentials, I'm going to be leading the discussion. Those of you that are familiar, welcome back. And those of you new, my name is Michelle Nagella, PhD of Behavioral Neuroscience and VP of Research and Innovation at HCD. We're going to do a little bit of webinar housekeeping. So I've just given you a little bit of description about what we're going to be going over today. But as you can see, some of the icons and features in this Zoom meeting, you can send questions to us via the Q&A. But you can also chat with us using the chat function. That might be a really great way for you to ask questions to the panelists or to us, or to share some of your thoughts and experiences as well. So we like this to be as interactive as possible. Today, we're going to be going over what is innovation and discuss some famous innovation fails, and also talk about how to ensure market success of your innovations. So for the panel, we will be doing introductions, and we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to all of the attendees for a Q&A so that you can ask us questions and ask, of course, these people that we have on the panel that know a lot better than we do. So without that, without further ado, again, participate as much as you can. We love participation. It helps out the conversation, and we'll answer your questions as best we can in the chat while we're live, and then a Q&A session at the end. Quick background on who we are. HCD is a full market research house. We have an approach that's grounded in a holistic consumer understanding, meaning how consumers perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli. And we use all sorts of different methods, anything from psychology to traditional market research tools to neuroscience and behavioral tools to look at products, packaging, and all the communications that you might have with customers or consumers. Our processes can be done in person or online and have been done all over the world. And our applied consumer neuroscience approach helps us to better understand the consumer interaction with stimuli across the entire human experience, from early stages of exploration all the way through validation, product development, through marketing. So I want to start off just this introduction to ask, what is innovation? Now, I'm not going to give a definition, but I just want to prompt you to start thinking about it. What does innovation really mean? We're going to be having the panelists go over their different definitions of what they feel it means. But a lot of times when we think of innovation, we often think of something that's revolutionary, but often innovation itself can be pretty stepwise as well. So sometimes it's just smaller improvements to a product, but it can be something that's completely disruptive, which is of course a key word. So we'll be getting into that a little bit more in the discussion, but I just want you guys to think about and start thinking about what you think innovation is when it comes to products or even processes, right? So services and processes, and not just, revolutionary products. And when we think about innovations, of course, there are huge failures. When you think about the food industry, there are some statistics out there that show that new market introductions have a chance of, I think, 75 to 80% market failure rate, which, is pretty extreme. But it's important to learn from mistakes, right? So thinking about some of the largest, biggest failures that have been out there, if we think about New Coke, right? That's the classic 80s blunder that happened that people still talk about today, where they did a reformulation, even though nothing was actually wrong with the old Coke, and the public was very negative, really turned on Coke for it forcing Coke to go back to the old, but then remarketing it with Coke Classic, which is actually a huge success. So again, it kind of has a nice story at the end, but the failure of New Coke is pretty classic, something that people talk about in schools to this day. There's also Colgate with their line of frozen dinners. So this ended up being a big bust and was immediately pulled from shelves really quickly because it was something that people just had a hard time wrapping their head around, that you would eat the Colgate dinner and then brush your teeth with the Colgate toothpaste. And so putting those things together wasn't exactly, appetite inducing. Another big one was Zune. And this was really Microsoft's Me Too answer to the iPod. And actually, it was probably a better product than the iPod. I know that's probably sacrilegious to say, but it was really good because it did some things that the iPod couldn't do. For example, being able to share to other devices, some things that people kind of struggled with Apple iPod, but it never really caught on, no matter how much money Microsoft poured into the marketing. There's also Google Glass. I don't know if you guys had tried it, but it came out a while back and it's kind of maybe considered to be a little bit too soon in the market. It was too expensive and there were huge privacy issues. And so it didn't really connect with consumers to really get into. And a big one that happened in 2012 was Bic for Her. So this was a new product that was a pen that was designed for women, meaning it was described as being, designed specifically for a woman's dainty hands and had appealing colors to her, being purple and pink. And of course, this was immediately called out for being sexist, got huge mocking reviews on Amazon, and was considered also a big failure. So these are things to really keep in mind when we are thinking about innovation, because how do you innovate and how do you do it successfully? Because, what does that really mean? What is innovative thinking? So here we have a cartoon where I'm happy to give you innovative thinking, but what are the guidelines? So how do you go about doing it? And do guidelines actually prevent you from being truly innovative? And how do you test your innovation to make sure that you're going to be successful in the market? These are all huge questions when we're thinking about our products and our brands and our services. So without further ado, I'm gonna stop being the lead talker on this. I'm gonna bring on and invite our guests to participate in this conversation. So if everybody could come off mute, make sure that your video is showing, panelists, and I'm gonna do a quick introduction. So first we have Alex, who is the founder and CEO of W2O, and he's a food technology, taste and smell, neuroscience. He's really smart scientist, focusing really on clean label ingredients. For example, if you think about plant-based flavors and sweeteners, things of that sort. So he's got a really deep understanding of innovative ingredients in that field. Zvi is an academic and a pharma biotech executive, really experienced in a lot of startups and pharma innovations. So he's got to have a really different insight there. Dolce is VP of Consumer Insights at Takasago, with extensive experience in both personal care and food and sensory, but really a leader when you're thinking about those consumer insights and way to really think about how to move insights into creativity and understanding how people use products. Zarak is a behavioral scientist specializing in insights for strategy, innovation, policy, design, and management. And he's going to really bring in some of that type of behavioral scientific thinking to this conversation. Bob is VP of Sensory Spectrum. Sensory and consumer insights is really what they focus on. And I know Bob from Mars Chocolate, where he's really experienced in innovation and product development. So you can see we have a diverse background here of people with a lot of really important insights and understandings. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off this conversation by asking everybody to sort of talk about what is innovation. What are some types of innovation? How do you describe innovation, when you're talking about it?
So when we were having this, meeting folks and kind of chatting about this the other day, I think maybe this is unfair to do on a panel, but I would like to volunteer Dolce to give her definition, because I thought
you did have a good one. You're right.
It was really good.
So I gravitate towards the definition given by Danny Ennis in a chapter that he wrote on the product innovation toolbox. I edited that book in 2012, and we're just writing the revision. So then it differentiated what's an invention versus an innovation. An innovation is something new, novel, something useful, product, service, but it retains that way, a curiosity, until it becomes activated, that somebody takes to commercialize it, make it available to large number of people. So we've seen very few folks wherein they are both creators and innovators. Yes, there's that. Steve Jobs, Bezos and all of that. But in most cases, they are different. And sometimes there's a lapse between the invention, the patent, or aha moment for those insights people, to the actual commercialization activation that really makes it useful for a large number of people.
Is there a difference between innovation and innovative thinking and just having a good idea?
Yes, an idea remains an idea unless you activate it. It's just information.
And
innovation has usefulness.
And I would build upon that an idea without a customer just stays as an idea, but innovation is something that is a key advancement, but there's also a need for it out there, and it addresses a unique need.
I would add on to that also. So an idea or even a innovative thought, what people seem to forget is innovation is a process, right? It's not this magical thing that just happens, right? So there has to be a process involved in it. And how do I take it, as Dulce said, from an idea to something that is actually commercialized and out there in the living world? There has to be a process for that to happen. It doesn't just magically jump from one to the other. I mean, believe me, I've worked on some excellent ideas that never saw the light of day. That still my family, bemoans that I showed them this thing, and why did that never get out there? And I was like, well, there's a whole story behind that. I can't go into that, but the environment wasn't there to make that idea into something bigger.
I see some key ideas coming from that there really is a commercialization aspect. Peter has commented that it's about that it needs to sell, right? So again, going from that idea to an actual innovation. And I think someone mentioned utility, right? That it needs to be useful. What types of innovation have you used that you think are very successful? When I'm thinking about types of innovation, you can, bring up some ideas that you have, but, there's disruptive innovation, adaptive innovation. What types of innovation have you either worked on or seen as being very successful when we're thinking about commercialization?
Well, I would like to add, this is Alex, a new technology can enable an innovation if it's hooked up with a profound consumer insight. So example would be, the stevia, the best tasting stevia sweetener is called Rab-M. It's rare in leaves, but a new technology like synthetic biology enable an industry to make the same sweetener, but 1/3 of the cost and 1/10 of the carbon footprint. And it has a life. It's because the consumer insight driving this is obesity, diabetes too, and weight management. So sugar reduction become the topic to address that profound consumer insight, and a new technology enable it. That's my 2 cents.
I think, Alex, the other version of that I just read about was natural colors, right? So 5 years ago, every company said, in 5 years, we're going to be full natural colors. And that has not happened because the consumer says, well, I still want my Fruit Loops to be very bright and vibrant, or my M&Ms to be very vibrant, and the natural colors can't deliver that, right? So I have this great innovation that seems to be what the world wants, but when you actually get it out there, it's not connected to what the consumer really wants.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Michelle, I'm thinking of like a couple different frameworks that I've used in sort of like explaining innovation or even just kind of deciding on what projects to work on that have been sort of useful. So when you ask about like which types of innovation, the way that I've kind of broken it up in my first innovation role, I was like, there's so many things coming at you all the time. And it's like, okay, most of these are tactics, you know, and it's like, oh, you kind of get confused. Like, is crowdsourcing the same as innovation? It's like, well, this is a tactic that you can use to sort of, you know, as Bob said, like it's a process, right? So there are different tactics you can use. And the two frameworks that I've found the most useful, one, just sort of in an innovation role in a big organization, was first I just went and I kind of wrote down like, what's everybody doing that they think is innovative, you know? And so there are people that are doing, you know, they're sponsoring hackathons and they think that's innovation. There's people who are, you know, building new products that is innovation. There's people who are, you know, looking for joint ventures and that's innovation. And so what I ended up kind of doing was making like this sort of three prongs, or actually I drew it out as like a garden. And so there was looking innovative, feeling innovative, and being innovative. And so like once I kind of categorized those things, it made it a lot easier to see like, where do I fit into this? So looking innovative is sort of like, it's basically marketing, right? And you can use the tools of marketing, you can partner with marketing team to do it, but it's basically reflecting out to, you know, the market, potential customers, competitors, and saying, hey, we're doing really innovative stuff. There's feeling innovative, which is sort of focused on your employees or maybe some sort of subgroup of customers, like kind of loyal users. And that's basically just meant to feel like, hey, I work at a really innovative place, or I buy from a really innovative company. And then there's sort of being innovative, and sort of as an innovation person, I was like, well, this is where actually what I should be spending most of my time doing. And that was more of like generating ideas, testing, you know, running experiments, building prototypes, building out infrastructure to scale up things that are successful. So that helped a lot in terms of just thinking, okay, where does this initiative fall and sort of who should be responsible for it? So that's kind of one bigger framework that was useful for me pretty early on. And then the other is just within that of sort of being innovative, what type of idea am I working on? So is this an incremental innovation? Is this, we'll call like an adjacent innovation, where we're maybe taking something we do well and taking it to a new market? Or is this a transformational innovation? It's a totally new business model. And that was helpful because, you know, some people, you know, without that clarity, think that a transformational innovation is going to happen on the same time frame and budget as an incremental innovation, where you're going to have the same amount of certainty around it. So that was really helpful in communicating it with peers, with colleagues, with senior leadership, as well as just sort of clarity for myself in my own role.
Like that framework.
I think when we think about innovation, and I agree in terms of it's a process, but what I try to focus on, I have focused on, is what is something that is a real issue early on in the process. Can you find something that is a pain in something that somebody actually does in order to enable that you get better uptake of that kind of process? For example, there are many people out there that are diabetics and they have to monitor their glucose levels. One of the stumbling issues is always trying to get people to take the blood samples. Nobody wants to put those needles in. It's painful. So an example is, well, what can you do in order to get the blood sample, but at the same time, alleviate the pain component? So one example is, I asked a question in terms of, all of us have gotten bitten by mosquitoes. How many of us actually realize when you actually get bit by a mosquito? It's the after effect. When it starts to itch for the most part, then you know that I was bitten by a mosquito. Yet they can take a blood sample. And so we actually went out and actually studied how mosquitoes take the blood samples and designed and developed needles to the same dimensions as a mosquito removes blood from an individual, and built it into a glucose sampling device. And that was, you know, a start of a total innovative kind of platform glucose
I
monitoring.
think that's really interesting and something that we had a little bit of a discussion about in our pre-discussion yesterday, which is where does inspiration come from? And there was a discussion about natural sort of sources of inspiration. So maybe if all of you could speak a little bit about that inspiration, where ideas come from. I know for us in a lot of our work at HCD, we focus on trying to uncover consumer pain points. So when they're in a situation, in an experience, working with a product, what are those pain points? Where are they struggling? Where are they disappointed? To your like literal pain in the description you have, Zvi. But I know that Jolte, for example, has had some really great sources where she, really looks at the landscape to really understand what's going on in the future landscape and make predictions. But where does inspiration come for innovations?
I think for just to think about where does it start or what I've been doing for the past few years is that really integrating many sources, focus in a way. One is understanding what we have, that's bringing in our technology people, and then understanding what's being talked outside, and that's where you can get inspiration from what's being published. Right now we can mine social media patterns, whatever. And the third piece, of course, would be consumers observations, understanding all of those. Behavior research is a great one. And so all of those, we start off with what we call a knowledge mapping, having a team look at all points, do a deep dive, and then understand what we know, what we don't know, where we want to go. And then partnering, obviously, with technology folks to see, is this feasible? I think all of those, I get inspiration from daily walks, from traveling, from restaurants, from chefs, but I also get a lot from the materials I read, as well as the technology meetings that I go to. And there's so many examples like that. If you hear a topic from 3, 4 different sources, from different environments, to me, that's a weak signal that needs to be amplified.
Mm.
I
I
think
think an
there's,
interesting, oh, go
I
ahead,
think
Bob.
there's also an interaction between what Steve said and what Dulce said. So that information I go out and get that is different when I'm just doing a line extension or something. Let's say I can go out and just talk to some people and say, what kind of flavors do you like? Or go to the flavor house and things like that. The things that we were talking about was like, look, I'm going to look in another whole other area. And that's where those real disruptive ones come from, because I'm like, because probably for years, the pain point, literally the pain point of me testing my blood. So it was like, well, I'm gonna make a different type of device. We have these little things that punch the needle in, and we have those were all sort of incremental. The big one came from, I gathered data from a mosquito. Like, that's where the disruptive ones come from, I think. So there's an intersection. It's not just I get information and I innovate. It's I get a specific kind of information, and that defines how I innovate.
Now, a few years ago, I went to the Pangborn conference, and there was a speaker who was talking about a change in research focus, being whether you're focusing on the product or you're focusing on the consumer, right? And so kind of a question that kind of comes up is the difference between innovations that come from consumer ideas or from the creative genius, right? So a lot of us talk about Steve Jobs as being an innovator, but most of the innovations out there come from heavy consumer research. So the difference again between looking at the product itself and trying to improve on the product or getting your source from understanding the consumer. If anybody can talk a little bit about that, it's almost like behavior of the consumer.
Yeah, I can take a swing at that. I think, it depends on the type of innovation that you're working on again. So this has been helpful for going back to those kind of 3 categories of like, if it's an incremental innovation, oftentimes it is pretty useful to get feedback directly from a user. So if it's, they have a product in their hand and they're using it and there's something that is not fitting in within their daily life, they're able to share that with you and you don't have insight into that because, you don't have insight into it at scale, that I think is useful. When it comes to sort of more like adjacent or transformational innovations, maybe not as useful. You know, and that's where it can be helpful to, I think of like the David Ogilvy quote, I'm going to mess it up, but basically it's like, you know, people don't know how they feel, don't say what they think, and don't do what they say. So if you ask somebody, I mean, so we, in behavioral science, we make a pretty big point of thinking about, and research in general, I think probably everyone on this call does, a big difference between stated preference, right, and revealed preference. So, you know, if you're building a product and you ask people what they want, well, there's lots of things that they'll say, but, you know, in reality, that might not be the case. So I think for those sort of bigger ideas, I like to kind of ground them in some kind of, you know, element of behavioral science or principle of behavioral science. But I think that, you know, it does involve more kind of creativity and a little bit more vision. But you need to kind of validate that along the way. Otherwise, you end up with a Zune.
And can anybody describe a little bit of some of the actual methodologies that you do in that you've used successfully, that you found have been really great for being inspiration? You know, I know some people throw around agile innovation processes, or, you know, consumer co-creation, all sorts of approaches like that. If you could kind of talk about your approaches to innovation.
I think I'll try to take a stab at this one, more in terms of adaptive innovation. Sometimes in the marketplace, you don't have the time and the luxury to basically come up with a whole new invention. But if you can take something which was invented for one market and apply it to a new market, so often you can actually achieve innovation in that process. I mean, case in B, I walk the malls and you know, look at what new electronic products come out. And if you look at some of the television screens, the computer screens that come out today, they're exquisite in terms of how different colors and the eye is really a great, you know, source in terms of discriminating different patterns in terms of different kinds of colors. Well, how do they do that? And what is the mechanism for actually doing that? And if you observe that way, can you then ask the same question, saying, can I take the same kind of technology that they use to manufacture TV screens or computer screens and manufacture a pharmaceutical in that manner? We've all seen the big pharmaceutical plants. They're huge. Well, can I streamline the entire process by adopting technologies in, for example, the television and the computer things? And those kinds of approaches for me have worked extremely well, of borrowing technologies from one market and applying it for a solution in another market.
One maybe just kind of practical tip that I've started to apply to my own life and conference attendance and that sort of thing is, I think one of the things that we've been talking about is diversity, right? So like diversity of opinion, like having diverse viewpoints, and you know, talking to people in other fields or other industries, seeing what ideas they have. When you sort of describe a problem, they're like, oh, that sounds like this. Like, here's what we've done. I have now kind of split up I used to go to events that they were kind of like sort of all in one, you know, and you have a little bit of kind of creative inspiration stuff, and then you have some that is sort of more practical. And I have decided that instead I just go to things that are one or the other. So conferences, events that are like very technical and related to things that I'm like working on immediately, you know, in the field or on a project that I'm working on. So it's like I can take this and I'll be able to use it tomorrow, you know. And so those are events where I leave at the end of the day and I go straight back to my hotel room and I'm scribbling down notes of, you know, all the things that I learned that I'm going to use as soon as I get back. And then the other are events that are very impractical and just very interesting, and they're meant almost exclusively to kind of, you know, be exposed to different types of ideas and different types of people and things that I would not come across just at a behavioral science event. So they're more geared towards sort of that creativity and like learning kind of other things that people are doing. And it just has a different feel. I end up taking different types of notes. Sometimes those ideas take longer to mature, but they're almost always more interesting. So that's just a
practical tip, at least for what I've been doing.
I said this yesterday in our pre-meeting. So I've been doing innovation for probably 30 years and lots of different processes, right? So I think we started with somebody from P&G who came up with this concept of, I don't know, this workshop kind of consumer labs, whatever they called it. Then I worked on this thing called lead user research, which was similar to what Zvi was saying. Like, I go out and I find alternative industries, right? So that was pretty interesting. Then design thinking came along, and we've done that, and now there's several different versions of that and all of this. And to me, the structure is the same. It's I got a question, a thought, an idea, something that I need to learn more about. So I go and I observe people, or I ask them questions, or I do all kinds of stuff, and I prototype, and then I test that with people. And this kind of iterative process is all the same. And I think they work, you know, I mean, they've all worked. I've worked on lots of different versions with lots of different suppliers and have gotten really great information out of those, but it all kind of starts with that. What's the challenge? What's the question? What's the stressor, as somebody said? Where's the pain point? What am I trying to relieve? It all kind of starts with that. And then I have to go dig in and figure that out and do the research.
So let's say you have your, oh, go ahead, Dulce, go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking what it's, it all depends, right? I like that word, you always use that. It's whether you're harvesting, there are cues already, you can see it, and you're trying to see which one of these I should play more or better or deeper, or you don't see it, you're fishing. It's below the surface, you don't see what's out there, you use different tools, right? So depending when you're beginning from below the surface or above the surface. And that's where I would adopt the tools. Below the surface, what always works, obviously, is in context, right? Understand where you're going. A lot of in context research. I really like ethnographies or forms of it. We used to do that face to face, but now we have many ways, digital, video, whatever. And we already have different ways of capturing real-time conversations and all of that. So I always put in the context of that in context research, have start off with the hypothesis and then go after the hypothesis and continue to create situations wherein you can test and then filter, reiterate, and all of that. So one of the techniques that I really like when you're already in the portions of wherein you're already prototyping, you already have something new, you have to test it in context, which in their daily life, wherein you're giving it to them not as part of a choice of all the other choices, but sometimes your competitor is not the category you're in. So putting them into the hands of the consumers in how they would really use it in context, and then along the way, understand how they're using it. And we already have many techniques around that. But what are the questions you ask? What are the things that you look for? How do they make their decisions as to why that product is going to be used? And as you know, we started off looking at liking, preference, purchase interest. But I'm speaking to the choir when we say we go beyond liking. We go after the value, the benefits that consumers are looking for. What are the trade-offs? Where am I going to put this into my daily life? And those preferences change with time. And so those are the things. One of the questions that we ask very successfully, it's a technique that I learned from Radapol and Altria, and when he was in Altria with Melissa Geltima, is this extended usage test. At the end of all of this in-context research, you ask a person, which ones of these would you like to take home again? Or would you like to use more? And it's interesting. We think that people will choose the things that are familiar, that is close to them. That is true. But there are people who will say, you know what, this one, there's something in it. I don't know what it is, but I want to try again. Those
like
are
early
the weak
adapter
signals.
type of people.
Those are the weak signals. Because if I can see it, it's not innovative. It's those attributes and benefits that they talk about that I'd like to build more.
So let's expand on that a little bit. So you're talking about some of the, doing in-context research, asking follow-up questions beyond just liking and purchase intent. How do we test that a product, a new product innovation, an improvement, whatever it might be, is going to be successful and worth putting money into the marketing for? Because this all becomes very expensive when you think about all those product failures, right? So whether it's the Zune, entrees, new Coke, right? The 80% failure rate. How do you go about preventing it? What are popular tests? Do they really work? What's the best question to ask?
It goes down to behavior questions.
Yeah.
Right? It's still around the behavior questions. What are those that are important to you? I remember doing a study on refreshing, and people were saying, Dulce, we have to ask liking. I said, no, we need to understand refreshing, because everything will be liked, but what's truly refreshing. And what we found was there were different degrees of refreshing. So if I only ask liking, I will only get what they like. I wouldn't know that they relate refreshing to various situations throughout the day, throughout different contexts. And that's what I mean. I think if I just rely on one metric, I remember, there's always have to be something else beyond liking. And I would say that would be a behavioral question.
Yeah, I mean, to, I guess, build on that a little bit, it's kind of related to a chat or to a question, I think, that's in the Q&A of sort of like the difference between sort of sort of stated preference, revealed preference. I think one of the lessons that I've learned is that early on, I've seen organizations sort of make this mistake of sort of choosing the wrong thing to measure early. And early on, like, it's usually helpful to prioritize learning about the product itself and how people interact with it. And so moving from the intention that people have, they like this, they have a preference here, to what are the actions or the behaviors that they are taking as a result of that. And in a lot of cases, it might be none, right? I like this, I prefer it, but I'm not actually going to do anything about it, right? So how do we actually bridge that gap between that sort of intention, that preference, to a behavior that we think is important, right? So those are the metrics that I think of as being important early on, are behavioral metrics. And then I think, to your question, Michelle, of how do you sort of prevent product failure, is you choose the behaviors that you can monetize, right? So you're learning about the things, the behaviors, the actions that people take that are relevant for your product, that give you confidence that these are the things that are going to sustain it, as a business line for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to put your business hat on at some point, right? So we can ask all different kinds of things or observe all different kinds of things, but there has to be a point where I transition it over and I get business support for it. Because again, as I said earlier, I can come up with the greatest idea, and if I don't have support somewhere along the way and the data to show that support, that this is going to generate X amount of money, or you have to invest X amount of money, or we have to build a factory, or whatever it is, that could kill that idea, right? So even if I have the greatest idea in the early stages and I answer all those questions, at some point you got to put your business hat on and say, what does the business need to move this, to buy into this idea and to move it forward? And those are some different hurdles that you might need to test on. So I've done all my upfront work, and I've got some great, behavioral things that I can show you. But what do you need as a business to pull the trigger? And they all use different metrics in that case, but you got to kind of bridge that gap. As Rock said, you got to kind of find a way to say, here's all this great stuff. What's the business part of it?
And
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Svi.
I think that comes in where you have different people that are involved in the process, because if you want to do successful innovation, it can't be just driven from people that are trained in one area. you can't have technical people just driving, well, this is great. I mean, I'm so excited about this new technology. People are for sure going to, buy it in the marketplace. But having different kinds of disciplines, individuals from different kinds of training, and together listening and modifying the product, I think that is a key in terms of getting uptake of the innovation out there.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to go back to a theme that I keep on seeing popping up is being consumer centric, but also understanding what technologies you have as a company. Dolce, you mentioned it. I see a great quote from Christoph here. Henry Ford, if he was to ask people what they wanted, they would want a faster horse. So when we're talking about really new and groundbreaking type of innovation where the consumer might not really understand the impact or the value that it has, do we approach that kind of research and those type of innovations in a different way?
I mean, to some extent, I think you can approach them. Well, I guess maybe I should say, it's probably always helpful to have a good understanding of the problem that you're solving, right? And I think that the Henry Ford quote sort of illustrates that, the problem is not like speed of horse. The problem is I want to get somewhere faster, right? And so, with that as sort of the frame, I think that is a question we can ask of any innovation, right? So whether it's an incremental, just sort of feature enhancement, or it is sort of like a bigger, transformational innovation. But to your point, Allison, I think that it becomes more important when there's sort of more unknowns. And so you're trying to understand, like, you have to be even more specific about what the problem is that you're solving because you don't have as much information about it.
Yeah, sorry, I think that Henry Ford's statement is a little bit skeptical about market research. To me, I think if we're smart enough, the key word of a faster horse is not the horse. The key word is the fast. If we, I think the original question that Michelle is asking us, how, what are the methods that really guide you to do innovation? So, I guess I don't have the answer, but I think I think that, if we at least know the key is the fast and not the horse, and then the rest of the innovation will be disruptive, and it will be a game changer. So actually, I want to break the rule a little bit. Michelle, I know you're the facilitator, but I also know you're an expert in this area. So I want to break the rule by asking you, do you have an answer to add to all the comments that we heard from the panelists? Yeah, excellent.
And I think she's maybe had dropped off for a second, but I can kind of answer from our perspective, from the HCD perspective, and then I want to turn it back on you all, because what Dalton said previously, right, context, that is really, really key. And making sure that you can have a fabulous product, you can have a wonderful innovation that is extremely useful, but if it is set within a context that is not going to be cohesive or harmonious with the expectation that the consumer has about, let's say, your brand, then there's going to be this disconnect. There's going to be some type of disappointment of the consumer because their expectations of, let's say, your brand are not being met by the innovation. So what we try to do is really focus on that, what we call the harmony. And really that's bringing in the context, whether it be the brand, the actual situation that this product is being used in, to really make sure not only behaviorally would they use it again, right? That we're going beyond liking and making sure that this is something that's going to perform well, but when it's actually launched into market, is it going to be really that product meeting the promise? So with that, I want to almost, turn it back on you all. And when you think about great innovations, how do we avoid alienation with these new innovations?
You mean, so alienation with the consumer or alienation within your company, whatever?
I think that's both.
Yeah, that's a
Right.
great point. Mhm.
Yeah, because you can definitely alienate your brand if you think about the Colgate example, right? Where, the Colgate is tooth care and dental care. So you're alienating your own brand in that regard. But, then the Coke example is alienating your consumer, right? Because they wanted the Coke Classic. So how do you prevent that? And maybe some examples you've experienced.
I mean, internally, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, is this sort of cross-functional teams collaboration, making sure that everybody who's needs to be on board is on board, because I think what definitely can happen is someone, it's a pet project, it's a technology they're in love with, and they're driving it and driving it and driving it, and they're end arounding all the time. They're going right to the VP or they're going to the president of the company. Nothing can destroy an innovation faster than that, because then you've just alienated all of the people you need to help move this along in the business process. So there's that part internally, and I think you avoid that by having clear objectives and stated objectives and collaborative teams, and everybody sort of on board, and none of this sort of end arounding kind of thing that can create real animosity.
I
I
think
think, go ahead.
I think to answer the last two questions, which is technology as well as alienation, we need to talk about prototypes. If there's technology, there has to be a prototype. So in our work around innovation, you need to have that at the hands of the consumer, get the feedback. The prototype doesn't have to be perfect, obviously. And it's that incremental conversation as you go from one prototype to the other. Don't wait for it to be perfect, obviously. And I remember years ago working for a cosmetic company, we were developing products and we were putting it into the consumers in a close context and getting feedback. We were very careful that it doesn't go out because, obviously it's very secretive, but the incremental learnings that we went through as we go through that technology changes was valuable. And the communication, the alienation is, when do you unblind it? Because as researchers, we want to blind things, but we have to remember we need to coach the consumers. We have to give them cues to show the benefit. And that's where I think the questions around, where do I test it for the context of the benefit, and when do I test it, that I need to unblind it to show that it's in the context of what they're currently using, the brand that I'm representing. Though all those questions are important as you go from technology to prototype to messaging and finally validation.
I
So
think
when
that-
we,
I-
go
I
ahead,
was-
sorry.
I think also to avoid alienation of the consumers, of the customers, how do you communicate the innovation that you actually have? Because sometimes consumers just don't understand what you're talking about. I'm going to give you an example of, we're hopefully coming off of this pandemic, but for the same individuals that have been taking their flu shots year over year, there are individuals that are reluctant to take the new COVID vaccines because I heard something about this is a messenger RNA vaccine or whatever it is, and you're going to be changing my DNA. We've gotten people confused out there. We have not communicated effectively to the customers, to the consumers out there. You might have a brilliant and a market changer in terms of innovation, but if you can't communicate it effectively, the customer's just not going to go for it.
So speaking of, the current situation, it's a huge disruptor, right? And so from huge disruptors like that, the pandemic, comes a lot of huge innovations, right? A lot of changes in the way we work, a lot of new products, a lot of, refocusing for a lot of companies, rethinking everything, right? A new normal. Which is something we all hate talking about now. But in thinking about that, like what's next? What's on the horizon for innovations? I think when we think about products, for a while there was huge about personalization, right? And customization. We have a huge technology boom, we have AI coming out. What do you see as the big innovations for your respective areas that you see coming in the future?
In food ingredient, I would like to offer that neuroscience is the future of food ingredients. Because for 100 years, 200 years, we study the compound. For example, nicotine is responsible for grapefruit flavors. And then we perfected the compound, what it is. But I think the neuroscience in the past 10 years has made so much advances. Now we understand why things are bitter and why things are sweet and why things are salty. And if we understand the human side, not the product side, we will be able to design better food ingredients, because now we know how to block it, how to make things sweeter without sugar, saltier without sodium. That's my 2 cents again. So not 4 cents.
I think I mentioned this yesterday, I think there's a sort of a refocusing that's going on around the user and user experience. And you see that with UX and CX and all of this emerging, even at the educational, at university levels. So it is sort of getting back to the base of why am I doing this? What am I doing? It goes back to who that user is.
I think for us, at least in the market research or insights realm, there's so much data. Not talk about big data. For futures, perhaps not so much the big data, also the deep data, but knowledge management. How do we manage all these sorts of this information? So we're going to probably see more knowledge portals, companies looking to organize what they have, and also how do they take information from the outside. If you have an Alexa or a Siri, you can have that in your own company, whether you do it yourself or you get somebody else to do it for you. How do you do that query so that you could jumpstart your research? The second part of that is the whole thing that I'm hearing from the research groups is all about democratization of the data. Who owns the data? Who uses the data? Are we just curators? And so I'm seeing that people are looking, yes, I want our team to understand, but in this whole thing around shortage of people, why can't we let our users access the data, educate them, show them, let them have access to those that are repetitive, that can be modeled, that can be analyzed, so that we can devote our time to more strategic thinking, do more of those innovation thinking that takes more time designing studies. And I think that's where, at least from the market research point of view, is where I think we should be. Manage our data, share our data purposefully, and continue to be the engine for strategic innovation.
Interesting. We have some questions here in the Q&A, and I want to make sure to open it up again to attendees to make sure to submit any questions or put something in the chat. But some questions here. Are you familiar with future thinking for successful innovation? Future thinking. Anyone played around with that? I know we talked about design thinking a bit. Anybody familiar more with futures thinking? While you guys ponder that, I will introduce one for Zarak here. Any research on best practices for behavioral science in research for do versus say insights?
Yeah, I think actually Dolce gave a pretty good answer to this already, which is, you probably want to use more than one method and continue to validate, right? So you might start with some kind of stated preference. I think that that's always valuable. I mean, even if people aren't going to necessarily follow through on that, it's useful to know that this is what they think they're going to do, like there's some statement of intention there. And then, you can sort of, from a behavioral science perspective, right, we kind of always view it as like with a little bit of skepticism of, well, is there some friction in this process? Is it hard to do? Is it, because otherwise it's like we would all be exercising every day and eating healthy foods all the time and all that stuff, right? So, we view it with a little bit of skepticism. So we want to validate that with some observation probably. And then, you can kind of continue that with prototyping and, identifying key behaviors that you think are going to be sort of important for, the success of your product or for enabling or facilitating the success of the user of that product.
And so this is a key question we actually deal with a lot, which is, okay, you've identified your pain point, you've created your prototype, and you're ready to go to market, connecting the product to the messaging and the marketing, right? Because ultimately, we talk about this a lot, that the product has to meet the promise made by the brand. Again, thinking about Colgate, right? Or, maybe Zune or whatever it might be. But do you have examples of innovation messaging that successfully teaches consumers a new behavior? So if we take some of those examples there, like maybe it's the Zune or maybe it's Google Glass, but how do you teach them an entirely new behavior that they weren't doing before? Through messaging, really, because you need to signal something either in your advertising or on the pack or something. Like you said, it has to be intuitive, right, to be successful?
I mean, I would just quickly say, I guess, that one of the kind of foundational sort of thoughts or principles in behavioral science is that providing information does not lead to behavior change. Or I guess I should say providing information sort of in and of itself doesn't lead to behavior change, right? So, of course, there are ways of making marketing more compelling and increasing motivation, but you kind of want to think about the timeliness of this. Are you increasing somebody's motivation right at a key point or moment where they're supposed to do something? But I think it always has to kind of start with, what are they supposed to be doing? And then, is messaging the right thing to help achieve that? Is it because they need a reminder or something like that? But if it's not that, it probably has to be something that's kind of built into the product, service, process itself.
Yeah, my designer friends would certainly say that the intuitive part of it should be the message, right? So if I look at something, I should be able to know how to pick it up, how to use it, what buttons to push, whatever it is. And if I have to explain it too much, you're going to lose that audience. So it's that sort of that blend of how do I make it look intuitive enough that people can just use it, and adopt it and all of that without being overly messagey, because that turns people off too.
Michelle, I think about Starbucks as an example. They overtly call it the third place in terms of messaging, but subtly they create a multi-sensory drinking experience in their theater. It's the sight, the sound, the touch, the taste and smell when you walk into a Starbucks theater. So I think about Starbucks I admire Starbucks. I used to work there, but I think they are innovative, and they kind of did it in a way that sometimes overt, sometimes subtle, but it is premium product, premium price, indulgent, and no compromise. Not apologizing for the sugar and the fat, but I think they are pretty successful, at least at the, I don't know now, but at least in the early days, they were pretty innovative in terms of linking the messaging to the product, to the pain point. They actually teach the consumer what the coffee experience could have been.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming up here on the hour. So any closing thoughts that you would like to give? Feel free to add your closing thoughts. While you do that, I'm going to share some information on the screen. Again, here are the names if you want to reach out to anybody, and please feel welcome to ask, offer your email addresses or LinkedIn or whatever you would prefer in the chat, so people can reach out to you. However, please follow us on our different social media outlets. This will be This has been recorded, and so we will be putting it up on our YouTube page. So make sure to subscribe so you can see some of our other videos and new things that come out. Or also feel free to reach out to us on any of the platforms, be it tweet with us at HCD Neuroscience or visit our blog where we write about all these topics, or email us directly. This has been super awesome. Thank you so much to all the panelists who are so experienced and knowledgeable about these things, which is exactly why we invite them. And thank you to all the attendees for attending. Feel free to reach out with any additional questions that we didn't get to. We tried to address all your questions and comments, but thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it off if any of you guys want to add in your last sense on innovation.
I would just give a quick thanks to you, to the attendees, to fellow panelists here. I think that one of the points that came up repeatedly over the course of our hour here was just sort of, different viewpoints, different industries, different perspectives. And so thanks for curating that for us here today.
Thank you. All right, everybody, have an awesome day, and we'll see you next time at our next webinar. More on that to come soon. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye, guys.